Today we're going to explore the 4 stages of a lesson, which shouldn't be totally unfamiliar to you all. You know that it's a very practical and evidence-informed framework that's going to hopefully achieve the intention of strengthening explicit teaching across the St. Thomas community. The work grew from our own internal evidence, so it's not something we've just read from a text. It's actually been born of the things that we're collecting in our day-to-day. So in our systems such as learning walks, what teachers shared in their CTTs, and what happened when we compared patterns from classroom to classroom or campus to campus. What became clear when we looked at that data was that, happily, great teaching is happening everywhere, but often it's really difficult to interpret in exactly the same way. And so those small differences in the interpretation of what makes an effective lesson can have a really big effect on how clearly students experience the lesson itself. One line that Chris comes back to every time we start our professional learning day is that Dylan William quote, "Every teacher needs to improve, not because they're not good enough, but because they can be even better." And so that really is the spirit of this professional learning video. It's not about adding something new. That's the last thing that we want to do, because we know that your workload is already at capacity. And it's also not about critiquing what people are doing in their classrooms. We trust your professional judgment. What we're doing here with the 4 stages is about sharpening and simplifying and also strengthening what already is working. So our students can feel that consistent rhythm across the classrooms, and teachers have a shared language. So when we are talking about teaching, it's very similar and we know exactly what we're referring to. The 4 stages is really going to give us this language. When used flexibly and professionally, it can help reduce cognitive load, which is very important through our breakfast bites that we've been participating in for the last 12 months. It can also support clarity, and it can make learning a lot more predictable for every student. The outcome of all of this is hopefully going to line up with our AIP, our annual implementation plan, which is of course to ensure that all of our students experience accelerated growth in literacy and in numeracy. And again, we all are teachers of literacy and numeracy. Thank you. So you might be asking, why bother with having this shared structure? One of the clearest findings we have found in our internal data, which I referenced before, was the variability, especially at the start of lessons, that existed across a number of different classrooms. Students were often trying to decode teacher expectations before they were able to decode the content. In essence, they were confused from the word go. For some classes, the purpose was really clear, however. In others, it was maybe a little bit more implied, or it was not identified really early in the lesson. And so the students were trying to think about, where is this lesson taking me, rather than just having that message delivered up front. Research into cognitive load reminds us that every moment spent guessing is a moment lost to learning. So if a student is trying to guess what's happening in the lesson for the first 30 minutes, there's no learning occurring during that period. A shared structure like this will help reduce that mental load, not just for the students, but for you as the teacher. It helps give the students a little bit more predictability and frees up their working memory for the actual thinking we want them to do, which of course is engaging with the content that you're trying to deliver. Importantly, this structure, the 4 stages, isn't about uniformity. It's not about making sure that everyone is teaching the same thing at the same time. What this 4 stages presents to us is a consistency in the quality while protecting the autonomy that you have in that space. The 4 stages are grounded in decades of evidence around explicit teaching, and they can be broken into these really key 4 components: introduction, modelling, guided practice, and reflection. So I want you to think of these as a bit of a learning rhythm. You can flex them, adapt them, you can stretch them or shrink them. And that really comes down to trusting your professional judgment, because you know your subject and you know your students more than I know your students and I know your subject. Keeping the rhythm, however, means that everybody in the room knows exactly what's coming next. Our learning walks show that every teacher starts the lesson. That's very obvious, but the quality and the clarity varied from classroom to classroom, teacher to teacher. What we do know from the research is that a strong introduction does 4 key things. Number 1, it names the purpose clearly. It connects to prior learning. It outlines what success looks like, and you might know this as success criteria. And it also previews the steps that the students will take. And this forms part of our visual schedule, which is why we've been harping on about that for a little while. When we observed inconsistent openings, students often entered these tasks really unsure about what the teacher expected of them. And so that uncertainty increased the cognitive load that they were carrying, and it actually pushed some of our learners into a really passive, disengaged mode. They're afraid of being wrong, and so it's really important that we're clear about this in our introduction. This is what success looks like, so they can move towards that goal. Some practical ways that we can strengthen an introduction would be to do really simple things like write your learning intention and success criteria where students can see them. So if you have one of those really awkward classrooms where not everyone can see the whiteboards, think creatively about where you might like to put those. Say them aloud in plain English. Get them to repeat them back to you. We've talked about choral responses in our breakfast bites, so that might be something you'd like to implement. Use a sentence to explain why today's learning matters. And I know that I often get the question in my math class, Miss, why are we learning about Pythagoras? It's not going to be important to me. Well, no, but perhaps the process of learning about this is going to be important to you for XYZ reasons. And another thing you might like to do to strengthen your introduction is to tell the students what the flow of the lesson will look like. And again, that comes back to our visual schedule and making it really clear. Completing a really good visual schedule means also those students that aren't able to attend class, whether it be for sickness or perhaps they're out on SIS, they can come back to it and actually engage with that content even though you're not in the room with them at home. So an introduction only really takes up to a minute. It can be a little bit longer. Again, we respect your professional judgment in determining the length, but it's really important because it sets up everything that follows for the rest of the lesson. Modelling was the stage that we saw a lot of variables across both campuses and multiple classrooms and multiple faculty areas. Some of our teachers modelled this really beautifully. So there was lots of cleared work examples, there was lots of think alouds, and there was really, really careful pacing, so they weren't rushing ahead. Others modelled really quickly and the students didn't see the thinking unfold, and it was sort of like just watching a teacher race across the board with an example before the students had a chance to actually unpack what's going on. Some teachers even over-modelled, and so by completing every step for students, it left no space for the student to try to figure it out for themselves. The research tells us that modelling is one of the most powerful tools that we've got because it reduces that unnecessary load and it provides a mental template for the students to follow so they know the steps, and it directly supports the transfer of knowledge from you delivering the content to the student being able to replicate the content in their own learning space. So what does effective modelling look like for your classroom? Got some key points here. So some suggestions might be to use one strong worked example rather than 5 smaller ones. Often I get feedback in a mathematics classroom that I've picked the easy question to model and then I give them the really complex ones to figure out. So be really careful and deliberate about the model that you're giving to the students and make sure that it is actually going to be helpful when they get to the task at hand. Don't be afraid to narrate your thinking is a really key one as well. Don't just show the steps on the board in silence. You need to explain why the steps matter. And it's okay to model if you make a mistake too. It might actually help your students recognize that it's okay to make mistakes. When you get to key decision points, pause a moment. Here I need to choose the best evidence. Here I'm deciding what operation to use. Here's the clue in the question that tells me what to do. So actually giving them that space to reflect on why you're pausing, and again, talking that through out loud helps them to make those connections themselves. Additionally, you can keep it really simple. So removing extra information that might distract the students from the main idea is a really great strategy to do when you're modelling as well. So these really small adjustments can make quite an enormous difference to the way that students uptake this information. So again, modelling is one of the most important stages of our 4 stages. The third stage is guided practice. This was an interesting one because a lot of our data had guided practice sort of all over the shop. Some lessons shifted really quickly from modelling to independent work and the students weren't ready. Some teachers were working overtime to fix misunderstandings afterwards because of that, which made things a little bit awkward and messy in the classroom space. In other lessons, we had some scaffolds that were so heavy that the students actually didn't need to think about how to get to the end of that learning period. So they weren't putting any of their cognitive skills in play at that point, which really undermines the long-term learning, the purpose around it anyway. Guided practice isn't about just telling them what to do. Guided practice is about shared cognitive responsibility. And so by that, we mean that students will be able to try the skill with your support. They're not alone, but they're also not carried at the same time. So it's this really delicate balance of giving them that assistance without doing the work for them. Some practical ways you might like to strengthen in your practice, the idea of guided practice might be matching the task directly to the model, so holding off on any super extreme curveballs, starting with 1 or 2 short questions instead of just jumping straight into a full worksheet or a full set of questions in the text. You might want to start circulating the classroom really early and quite frequently. So getting up out of your seat from the front of the classroom in that traditional teacher model, moving around the tables, asking clarifying questions and giving that quick formative feedback when it matters to the students. And finally, you might like to ask students to justify a decision. Something like, why did you choose that method? Or what made you pick that example from the text that you're analysing? This is going to tell us whether the students are genuinely ready for independence, or if they need a little bit more assistance from you to get across the line there. The last stage in the 4 stages is the reflection stage. And our learning data showed us that while many lessons ended, obviously because the bell went, their lesson didn't always conclude. A short reflection task can really help the student consolidate and helps us to get a bit ahead of planning tomorrow so we know where the students are at in that learning process. It also helps us to turn the lesson from being something that is teacher taught to student learned, which is, it helps to remind me of this quote I had from Greg Mitchell, who did some professional learning back when I was a graduate teacher, and he talked about being a transactional teacher or a transformative teacher. So are we simply just transacting information, or are we transforming student learning? And I think that that's something I'd like you to reflect on here. So some effective reflection can be as simple as implementing some things like a quiz question before the students finish, a sentence stem like today I learned, or the hardest part of today's lesson was yada yada yada. Another thing you might like to implement would be a quick check for understanding on your mini whiteboards, which we have across a number of classrooms, or even just asking 2 students at random, cold call, again, something else we've unpacked in our breakfast bites every Thursday morning. So cold call on 2 students to give a bit of an explanation of the idea or the concept or the analysis that you've been doing in their own words. And I love to do this with my VCE kids with an exam style question at the end of every lesson. Reflection, it really helps to close that loop, and it creates some visibility about how impactful you've been in that lesson. The visibility can come as a benefit for both you as the teacher and for the students. So it'd be really, really good to try to implement those exit tickets we've spoken so much about in the past, because their responses might very well guide your decision to move on from that concept, or if you need to revisit it the next lesson. The 4 stages sits really comfortably inside our learning and teaching cycle. They don't replace it, and they also don't compete with it. I find that when you compare them together, and I've tried to replicate that in an image on the screen here for you, so forgive me for my terrible graphic design skills. But what I do feel is that when we look at the 4 stages and the learning and teaching cycle, is that they actually solve one of the gaps that our internal evidence highlighted. So when we looked at the learning walks and the coaching conversations, and of course the data from our CTT reflections, we saw that teachers were really confident with the bigger parts of the cycle, which is the planning and assessment and reviewing components. But the variation was inside the teaching phase. So the part that happens within the lesson and the minute by minute components of teaching. And I think that this is where the 4 stages can really help promote a little bit more clarity in that space. The 4 stages, they give us quite a clear and predictable structure within that teaching phase, and that helps to reduce the cognitive load for students, as well as supports more intentional sort of instructional choices for the teachers as you're delivering these lessons. So you can think about the assessment and planning part of the cycle helps us decide what to teach. The 4 stages help us to deliver it in a really clear and effective way. And then finally, the reviewing and adjusting components of the learning and teaching cycle become a lot easier, because stage 4, our reflection piece, gives us the evidence to work with. So we're able to see whether or not we're effective or affective, and what sort of changes or updates or amendments to our learning structures we need to make. So to sort of summarize that, the learning and teaching cycle gives us the whole map, and the 4 stages gives us the turn-by-turn directions. The other thing about the 4 stages is that it aligns beautifully with our whole school approach to positive behaviour support. We've got our predictable routines, which we're really great with, and that includes our do nows, our lining up outside the classroom, our hands up if we have questions, calm transitions, etc. The things that help students behave well, we need to also recognize they help them to learn well. So I think there's this beautiful synergy that we've got between our routines, our learning and teaching cycle, and what the 4 stages are going to bring to the table as well. On that note, I want to reiterate that this isn't a new program and it's not an add-on. It's just a way of making the middle of our cycle a lot stronger and consistent. And therefore, it's going to be a lot more supportive for students as well as you guys as teachers, reducing that cognitive load and reducing the amount of reflection and time that you need. So we've looked at how the 4 stages fit inside the learning and teaching cycle, and now I want you to see how it could play out in a real lesson. And for that, I've picked one of my Year 10 law and politics examples. I've chosen it deliberately because it's a very boring lesson. It can be quite dry. By no means is this something I'd like to showcase outside of the college. This is just a very generic type of classroom, which is something that we experience every day. So when we looked at our internal evidence, we saw a consistent theme of teachers knowing the stages of learning, but the practice and the flow was a little bit sometimes compressed, or at times it was skipped or even out of order. So students spent in their classrooms a lot of mental energy trying to work out what the task actually required, rather than just engaging with the learning, which is what we want them to do. So in the example I've got here, you can see how each stage supports the next. So the introduction, I started with that purposeful question. This sort of broke ground in the learning. It reduced the ambiguity and it activated their prior knowledge, because I know in this example that the students had to have known about individual rights, which we'd studied in previous lessons. And of course, knowing this means that the students know what the lesson's about and why it matters to the learning that's going to occur today. From there, we looked at modelling. So instead of jumping straight into the analysis and straight into questions from the text, I unpacked the law by identifying, whose rights were affected, or what harm the law was trying to prevent, or how those two elements interacted. And so the modelling became really short and really visible and quite transparent, which is a key point that the learning walks highlighted. We needed more consistency across classrooms in making things a lot clearer for the students. From there, the students were able to use those sentence stems that I provided to them, and that they matched the model. They weren't more difficult. They were at a similar cognitive level, which meant that they could start applying things themselves without me giving them tasks that were too complex for them. At the same time, I was able to move around the classroom and give some of that formative feedback at the time that it mattered, which is when they're completing the work, as opposed to at the end where they couldn't change anything. Finally, I finished the lesson with an exit ticket. Do you agree with the curfew law, and why? And this gave me some evidence that I collected them at the end of the lesson, and it told me whether or not I was an effective teacher in that space, and what concepts I needed to perhaps uncover the next day for them. It also told the student, yes, you learned something today, and here's your chance to show it. And I think that they sometimes need that little bit of, here is the thing I've created, which is easy to see in our practical lessons, but not so easy to see in those conceptual lessons where we've got to put pen to paper for a lot of it. So this isn't about teaching law and politics. This is just about the structure of the lesson, and it was that rhythm that was really predictable. It didn't matter about the subject. And so what this shows us is that the 4 stages doesn't necessarily mean more work for you. It's just a way to streamline what's already happening and make it a lot clearer for the students, make it a lot of a calmer classroom. And cognitively, it's a little bit lighter for our students, which is, going to help in the behavioural aspect of it all as well. I'm going to take a moment to just pause here. I'll get you to pause the video. I'll try to put some relaxing music over the top. But think about the stage that you feel is most strongest within your current practice. What stage perhaps you are more likely to skip. And remember, this is not us telling you you're doing the wrong thing. I want you to see this as an opportunity to continue to improve practice. Again, remember that Dylan William quote. And if you do finish very quickly, find someone to have a bit of a conversation with, perhaps someone that's observed you to teach during one of your learning walks or their learning walks, and see what they observed. Because often we can be either overly critical of ourselves, or we can sometimes even tell ourselves we're doing a lot better than we actually are. So take some time now to have a little bit of a break and have a bit of a reflection about your own practice. I've got another example here which came from a previous VCE VM lesson. So this really showcases how the 4 stages work in practice. The slide on the screen here is a first draft of a student's pitch for what we call an unsellable product. And the student had really good ideas and was quite excited about the project, but the structure wasn't there yet, which reflected that pattern in our internal data. When the modelling wasn't visible, the students had to sort of guess what I was looking for, and the result was a little bit more rambling or very unclear. And yes, that's my daughter Aubrey. She did give me permission to put her photo in here, and she was very happy to tell me all the things that she would buy if she was able to be given a credit card. So this is how I taught the lesson using the 4 stages. I began my introduction by showing 2 different pitch examples, and this is very important for me to note. This isn't what we regard as modelling. This was just about making the purpose and the success criteria clear, so the students weren't guessing about what a pitch sounds like. So our internal evidence had highlighted that students really benefit enormously from this kind of early clarity, and that's why I was intentional about showing 2 different examples of pitches from the Gruen transfer. And of course I made them contextually appropriate because we know that can get a little bit MA rating. From there, I went into proper modelling. So I demonstrated my own thinking on how to craft a hook, how the tone shapes audience response, where the persuasive devices fit. So I brought in a little bit of my English background there as well, and how to structure the message. And what this did was address one of the strongest findings across our learning walks. Modelling was happening silently rather than being made exceptionally visible. From there, students drafted short sections while I circulated with very quick formative feedback. This was another stage that was quite inconsistent across our learning walks, and often it was skipped or sometimes it was too much of the lesson, which kept keeping focus a little bit difficult. And then finally, when I finished this lesson, I asked the students to answer that quick prompt, what changed after feedback? And what that did was give me some evidence to inform my own teaching. And it also reinforced their awareness of the learning process. This slide here is the after version from the same student. So it was the same idea, but now the student had some structure and some clarity and a bit of purpose behind it. The modelling was visible at the beginning, so the student could apply these techniques that they'd seen. They'd introduced a stronger hook, they had a really clear problem and solution shape, and they had some deliberate persuasive choices. So this whole process aligned quite directly with the research. When the modelling was concrete, the guided practice was intentional, the students were able to transfer the learning much more effectively. Finally, the exit ticket was really quite game-changing for me. The student clearly explained what improved and why in this exit ticket. The energy in the opening, the use of alliteration, and the tonal shift was evident. This kind of metacognition didn't happen initially before I introduced the 4 stages, and therefore it didn't happen by accident. This is what happens when we sequence the learning deliberately and we make it visible. It also reflects another pattern from our evidence, which is when teachers make thinking visible and support the practice in manageable steps, the students can name their growth and repeat it in future tasks. So the learning that this student took from this VM lesson, they're able to take into future lessons and then life beyond high school. The VM example is a really good reminder that when the learning sequence is deliberate and when it's visible, the students have got the capacity to grow quickly, even with something that's quite as quirky as the unsellable product. It's also a reminder of something that's just as important, maybe even more so. The 4 stages didn't change who I was as the teacher. It didn't change my style. It didn't change the personality or the flair that I brought to the classroom, and it didn't change the way I connected with the students. What it did do is that it gave the learning a bit of a clearer shape. And that brings us to a key point in both the research and the internal data. The structure should support autonomy. It doesn't replace it. Across the learning walks and CTT reflections, we were constantly saw that the teachers at our college were making really, really thoughtful and intelligent decisions, as they should be. We trust your professional judgment. The challenge, therefore, wasn't the capability of teachers, it was the consistency in the way that they approached the lesson. So without the shared structure, the students were navigating all sorts of different versions of how learning works, from room to room and classroom or faculty to faculty. The 4 stages doesn't remove teacher judgment. It doesn't flatten the subject expertise, and it doesn't standardize personalities. What it does do is reduces the student cognitive load, and it helps to give us this shared language for talking about our practice, while still leaving space for every teacher's strength. So it's consistency of quality, it's not uniformity of approach. Once we recognize that the 4 stages supports teacher autonomy instead of restricts it, the next question, of course, we're going to ask ourselves is, well, why does this structure make such a difference to learning? Across the research and across our own internal data, the patterns were remarkably consistent. First of all, cognitive load. When lessons followed a predictable rhythm, the students didn't waste mental energy trying to figure out what's happening in that space. They could invest their working memory in the actual learning of the lesson. And we saw this really clearly in the classes where the introductions were quite tight and the modelling was visible. The students settled faster and engaged sooner, and behavioural issues were less of a problem than they were in other spaces. Secondly, effective modelling. The research was exceptionally clear again. Learning improves when teachers make their thinking visible. So our learning walk showed that modelling was sometimes rushed or silent, and sometimes it was just skipped altogether. When the modelling became explicit, like we saw in the VM example or in the law and politics example, student performance lifted almost immediately, and they could name that as well. Thirdly, improved transfer. So the guided practice component, when matched closely to the model, it helped students to apply these ideas quite confidently. In those lessons where guided practice was missing, or it was overly scaffolded in that, the teacher was doing all the thinking for the students really struggled to operate independently, both in the classroom and later on when they were given their homework to complete over night time. Finally, there was better evidence for planning. The short reflections at the end of the lesson gave me and teachers that we collected data from that immediate insight into the student understanding. It really strengthened that idea of the review and adjust part of our learning and teaching cycle without adding any extra workloads. Again, the 4 stages is not more, it is just something that works within. So it makes the learning clearer, it makes it a lot lighter, and it really makes it more intentional for both the teachers and the students. The 4 stages is never the intention to complicate the lesson. It just makes it a lot sharper. So the good news is that you don't have to go ahead and overhaul your entire teaching practice to see the impact of the 4 stages in play. The biggest gains that we got from our internal data and in the research, of course, came from those really small intentional adjustments. So if you want to try something tomorrow, here are a couple of ideas to keep it really simple. In your introduction, clearly outline your visual schedule and make a learning intention and success criteria clear. That's all you need to do. That alone reduces a huge amount of cognitive load for these kids. In the modelling stage, so stage 2, choose just one clear model. Even if it takes a little bit longer, talk through the key decisions, talk it through out loud, make mistakes if you need to make a mistake, and then talk through how you work through that mistake. Model it for these students. Slow down your thinking, because that's what makes their thinking possible. In stage 3, the guided practice stage, try to match the practice directly to the model. So a few short examples is plenty. Circulate the classroom really early and do it frequently, so you can give targeted feedback, formative feedback, before those misconceptions become a habit for the students in this learning process. And then finally, in the reflection stage, finish with one quick check for understanding. It can be an exit ticket or a sentence stamp or a simple question, or even a hands up, 5 for I get it or 1 for I don't get this, because that's going to give you evidence for tomorrow without adding any extra marking to your load. The key thing for you to remember is that it doesn't have to be perfect or polished. Consistency here matters more than the complexity of what you're delivering. If we make these really small moves across all classrooms, students are going to experience clearer routines, they're going to have calmer starts, and they're going to feel a lot more confident in their learning, which is exactly the type of environment our evidence tells us that they need. And to come back to that Dylan William quote, we want to improve not because we're not good enough, but because they can go do even better. Right? So we're really setting our students up for success if we have that perception of ourselves and our students have that perception of ourselves. So let's bring this all together. The 4 stages gives us a really shared structure that strengthens the quality of teaching without limiting the individuality that is you as the teacher in the room, as the performer in the space. Our internal evidence and the research both pointed to the same thing. When lessons have a clear rhythm, students can learn more easily and teachers are able to work more efficiently. And so the whole classroom feels a lot calmer and a lot more predictable. The goal of the 4 stages isn't about uniformity. It is consistency of quality. And if we use these stages really flexibly and intentionally, they become a professional tool and something that supports our judgment rather than controls our judgment. Thank you for the work that you do every day, for the way you care for our students, and of course your openness in strengthening your practice across the campuses. These small deliberate changes make a real difference, and together I really do believe we can set those high expectations for our students and we can see that accelerated growth in every learning area for our kids. So as we continue to build some consistency and clarity across classrooms, across the school, there are plenty of supports available that I wanted to remind you about. You don't have to do these 4 stages on your own. In fact, they work better when you work with others. So you've got the desktop infographic that I'm going to provide to you all shortly. You've also got the annual implementation plan, which links this in so you can see where it fits with our overall aim as a school. And of course, you've got your coach or mentor to talk through these ideas and try things out. You can also talk through these ideas in your collaborative teaching teams and also think about how you might like to implement them in your learning walk evaluations. Is there an area you'd like to focus on? For instance, for me, I'm definitely going to try to work on reflection a little bit more. So that's going to be the aim of my next learning walk. Your pedagogical coach and the deputy principal for learning and teaching, their teams are here as always because they are there to help you plan and to experiment and to reflect. And we also have an article library if you're interested in reading some of the research behind this, if you want to go a little bit deeper in it all. In short, use whatever you think is most helpful for your students and for your style. Don't lose what makes you a special teacher in that space. And as always, remember your professional judgment leads this work. We don't tell you what to do because we trust that you know what you're doing.